thank you for joining us for our next panel, which is going to be on women as market shapers and sort of a more consumer-led retail focus. So I'm joined by the lovely Faye Soteri from Watch World With Faye. There's a lot of W's. And then we've got Sarah from Bonhams, Ellie from Bremont, and Scarlett, who's a journalist. Thank you all for coming. So I guess, like we did at the start of the other panel, if you'd like to go through and just say a little bit about your careers, how you're here today, what brought you here?
Well, the invite brought me here. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, actually, for having me. I felt really privileged to be asked. My name is Faye. I've been in the watch industry for about 25 years. Started my career, a long career with Watches of Switzerland, global watch buyer, UK for the first 15 years, and then the latter part, as we grew internationally, was able to look after and support the growth in North America. After 20 years, I decided that I didn't want anything to do with watches ever again, and took a small career break. And then I really missed watches, so I launched my own podcast, Watch World With Faye, which meant I could continue the conversation, stay in the industry, work with some brilliant brands and people that I have spent 20 years getting to know on both sides of the pond, and that's why I'm here today.
Thanks. So I started in the auction industry about 15 years ago. I'd always wanted to work in auctions. My childhood was spent being dragged around antique shops, auction houses, that kind of thing. I originally did want to start working with jewellery, and my first job was as a specialist covering jewellery, watches and coins, and that was in Glasgow. But I soon realised I wasn't really seeing any exciting jewellery, but at that point in time, the pre-owned watch market started to pick up, so I started to see watches making quite a bit of money, and so I made a natural kind of shift to kind of where the interest was. And I sort of haven't looked back. I've worked for 3 different auction houses, and I've been with Bonhams for 2.5 years now, and I love it. So yeah.
Well, there we go. Perfect, thank you. So my career is kind of broken out into 2 decades, I would say. The first kind of 10 years of my career, I started within the sports marketing industry, had a really big passion for sports. And like the conversation earlier about not being educated about kind of the watch industry, for me, I was just kind of very silo driven that I wanted to work kind of in sports and sports marketing. And then I sort of stumbled into the luxury watch world actually through kind of sports marketing. I joined Tag Heuer because at the time in the UK they were looking for someone who understood kind of sponsorship and partnerships and communication. So then ensued kind of 7 years with Tag Heuer, both in the UK, and then I actually moved to Geneva and worked out of the global team there for a couple of years. I had a little secondment about 3 years ago to join Bang & Olufsen, the Danish luxury audio company. So I moved over to Copenhagen and worked for them for a couple of years, and then the opportunity to come back into the watch industry with Bremont presented itself about a year ago. So very happy to be back in the watch industry and back in the UK.
Hello. I spontaneously found myself as a watch journalist. It was something that I never saw in my career or pipeline at all, as I'm sure many people in this room have found themselves in the watch industry. So I started out as a fashion journalist, and it was all due to a impromptu LinkedIn message that I now find myself sitting here on this panel. So this is my 5th year in the watch industry, which I'm very aware is still very, very rookie numbers. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you. So I guess we'll go straight into the deep end here. For years, I think we'll all agree that watches have been pink it, shrink it, stick a mother of pearl diamond on the dial, bejazzle it. So do you think we're seeing women actively reshape what watch design looks like now? And are there any clear examples of that shift, or potentially not a shift, as the case might be? Faye, maybe from a retail perspective?
Thanks, up first. No, we are moving very much away from the shrink it and pink it, which is fantastic. And I think what brands are looking to do more is to speak to collectors, and it's not gender specific. We don't talk about cars as a gender. We don't talk about houses as a gender. We're moving away from what brands have previously have done to appeal to a female collector, which is where the growth is, because we're seeing a trend also where men are wearing much smaller watches. The Cartier Panther. Timothy Chalamet has led that in terms of what, and that's traditionally a very female brand. So it's this. The swing is going in both directions. So there is a real movement, but I don't think we should move away completely from gender specific. I think you can refer to it as feminine or masculine as a piece, because that's an opinion, or a larger case size or a smaller case size. But to identify a watch as for it to be gender led, one of the statistics from the last panel, where it was over 50% of men buy watches. What we don't know is how many they're buying for women as well. So I don't think it's the right way to look at watch buying anymore.
Do you think that's an unusual thing for the watch industry, where I feel like the gender neutral approach is sort of coming from a fashion perspective? That's always been sort of the narrative, as gender neutral, gender, that sort of thing. Do you think that's still important then to keep those categorizations from a retail perspective in terms of like shoppability?
I think clients are well informed now. Women are really well informed about product, and more so with complicated pieces. It's not just, we'll just, what's the difference between a quartz and an automatic, and then with them being educated at the retail at point of retail. Women are really well informed on what they're looking for. So it's down. The gender neutral element, it's a watch. It doesn't have to have a gender. It just has to be appealing or exciting or engaging to the watches are personal. A watch doesn't just tell a time, it tells a story. Women know exactly what they're looking for when they go in to buy a watch, the same as with a car or a handbag, etc. It doesn't matter. We shouldn't keep labeling things with either gender neutral or masculine or ladies or gents.
And Sarah, is that something you see in collectors that you find at Bonhams coming to you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we're quite privileged as well, because we get to lay out a sale in an order that we think makes sense. And therefore, we've got a natural mix there. So when people come in to look, we can literally show them anything. They're not kind of funneled in a direction. So there's not an obvious space for a woman to go to or a man. And so we actively, as a group, we've got a really mixed team. There's 4 women and 3 men in our kind of London, like our UK team. And we're all there and we're available to speak to. And we will actively put watches in front of people, even if they sort of haven't asked us to. So especially, I think, at Christmas, we had a lot of events around our fine sale. So you've got all sorts of different people coming in. And if it is a chap that's come in and he's led the visit and he's got his partner with him or a friend, I and my colleagues will put another watch out and say, why don't you try that on to the women? And often I especially will put a bigger watch out because I'm used to wearing them. And you're almost kind of, you're trying to challenge them, but you're trying to kind of open their minds to that. I do think there is a lot more of an open-minded kind of attitude in general for men and women, like we were just saying. I think people are seeing different sizes on different people. And hopefully that is trickling down to the kind of the clients that are coming through. But definitely people are not so rigid and defined by what they feel they should be looking at.
And from a brand perspective, how do you see that influence the designs that your newness? Do you see women actively reshaping that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think, the previous panel references as well, I think the watch industry is maturing, and I think from a kind of marketing and brand perspective, the brands are also becoming more educated. We've got more data, we've got more understanding about the end customers, and that's happened over the last decade as well. Who do you want to be speaking to? It doesn't always have to be led by a gender, but it can be someone's interests or someone's passions, or you're trying to clue into or attach yourself into specific interests, hobbies, rather than it being this is for a woman, this is for a man. So I think from a design perspective, brands becoming much clearer on who they're trying to speak to without defining is that a female or a male, but just someone that, for us, someone that's interested in adventure and exploration. That doesn't have to be defined by a gender. That's someone who has a passion or an interest in a certain area. And I think that really defines kind of what we're looking at in terms of our inventory and our product designs. I think the jumping hour has been a really good example. So obviously Bremont launched a jumping hour at Watches and Wonder of last year and subsequent jump hour launches, and we've seen that the interest from the end customer has been completely mixed and across the globe. That's not just a UK-centric story. We had the aventurine piece that we launched at Dubai Watch Week in November, and that was a really even split there of ladies and gentlemen that were interested. And it wasn't defined by the design principles are what interested them, but we weren't being specific about who that watch was for, and we didn't market that way either.
So does that new sort of growth of understanding of the woman as a consumer change how you market towards them?
Yeah, exactly. So we're trying to be more led by kind of demographics, or kind of less demographics, so not being principled by male, female, or age, but being more led by interests, hobbies, and that's how we're trying to kind of build the marketing and the prescription on our communication strategy, because ultimately, as the ladies were saying, it's a watch, it's an emotional piece, it's less defined by, is this made for a female or male?
And Scarlett, I guess we see a lot of press releases. Do you see that sort of communication change in the 5 years that you've been doing it?
I'm probably going to come in and be like the cynic now on the panel talking about this.
Someone has to be.
I agree to the point that was made about the industry maturing, for sure. And yes, there has been clear change in my small 5 years of working in this industry. But for me, you talk there about genderless and removing these labels. I don't necessarily think that we should. I think if you're going to have this distinction of having a woman's watch and a men's watch, let the woman's watch actually speak to what women want. And for me, making it genderless sometimes can feel like a lack of accountability for actually sitting down, having focus groups with women, talking to them about what they would want and how they would feel seen. And for me specifically, I think in joining the industry and hearing that phrase that you said, Ella, of pink it, shrink it, put diamonds on it, I then preconditioned myself, having known nothing about watches on day one, to being taught that I shouldn't like these watches because women all want these watches. And I find myself more and more over the years being like, oh my God, I actually really love that mother of pearl dial. And I've found that I've put a distance between myself and that watch because of this sort of stigma we have around it. And I think it's absolutely okay to have these models in a catalogue and say they are for women, but it's about making sure the rest of that catalogue as well that you market towards women's watches speaks to the needs that they want. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, but it leads me on to my next one. So where do you see that biggest disconnect between what women are being presented and what they actually want? Like, what do you think? How do the brands speak to those women more directly?
I think one thing that's important to remember from a press side of things is that you're hyper vigilant to trends that are happening. As much as the brands are forecasting years ahead, I know, for instance, if I speak to my female friends about trends in the watch industry right now, we all know in this room that stone dials are very much having a prolific moment. If I talk to my girlfriends, they have absolutely no idea that stone dials are popping off right now. And it's the same thing with the fashion industry. If I sort of tap my brain out for what's happening right now in like London, Paris, Milan, I'm not aware of the trends because I haven't really tapped into that. So I think it's important to remember that I'm communicating on all of these trends day to day, and I should know the ins and outs of them. But the average end consumer doesn't necessarily know this. So I think there's so much more scope to play with here. And, I can sit and write a lovely article about the 10 best stone dial watches to have right now, but that's not to actually say that those female consumers are walking into that retail space or online or whatever and buying them. So I think with that regard, we're still perhaps a little bit blind to what women actually want. I think the spectrum is far bigger than we think it is. It's not just a case of leaning into the trends, and it's not just a case of rehashing out mother of pearls, etc. I think it's a lot broader than that. I
was about to say, Ellie, is there anything from a brand perspective that you do to understand?
It's a really interesting perspective, because I guess my question back is, do we need to be trying to segment into male and female? I mean, ultimately, as brands, we're trying to kind of sell watches and to grow. Ultimately, do we need to define, does it need to be that way? Like, what's the benefit of doing that? If we're creating beautiful timepieces that are appealing to an audience who the brand are trying to speak with, does it matter, and does it need to be so driven as hard as like creating watches? As long as it's for the segment that each brand is trying to speak to, that's the goal. We're not trying to make watches for everybody. So it's an interesting perspective.
I think the best example I could give that, and this is from 2 years ago, this was when Hermes released the Cut. For anybody that's unfamiliar with this watch, it was subtly marketed towards women. So the H08 was always positioned as their sort of male watch, and then the Cut, which came out, was positioned as the women's watch. However, their marketing didn't go to the point of, this is our brand new women's watch, this is targeted only for this audience. However, it was hugely enamored by so many women, and to the point where there were so many men that loved it as well. It was released during Watches and Wonders 2 years ago, and I remember in Pell Expo, after having the meeting, there were a lot of male journalists and I discussing, and they were all like, we want it. And I hadn't seen a watch that had been co-opted almost by women first and then trickled into something that men love, because quite typically it's the other way around. Like, I don't know how many women here today are wearing a watch on their wrist that is, if we're being very, old god and stereotypical about it here, a man's watch, or was perhaps on the website in the men's section. So I'm not saying at all that we need to be so definitive of, one side is black, one side is white, but I just think there needs to be more sort of force behind making women's watches a bit more, like, have their own identity a little bit more, is what I think I'm saying.
But who's winning there? Hermes, because they've got men and women buying into their piece. Happy days.
For sure, yeah. And I think the interesting that you make out there is that, another example I would talk about is Chanel. I'm now naming two brands that have it's not necessarily advantage, but they have the history of being both a fashion and watch enterprise, and they have that storied history because of it. So does that sort of heritage that they have with, making luxury leather goods or creating clothes, etc., and pieces of fine jewelry, is it because they have more of I don't want to say experience here, but they have more of a storied history of knowing how to make their products feel perhaps a little bit more fluid, but also if they are focusing primarily on women only, it does speak to...
Both brands you've listed, though, are very female-led brands, particularly on the fashion side, so that's already got a captive audience. It's what do brands like Panerai and IWC do that have traditionally been much more male-focused in their marketing approach and their product design. So I think everyone is now stepping up and coming to the table. For me, it's about authenticity from the brand. It shouldn't be, we haven't got a female collection or a male collection. If you're loyal to the brand, Vacheron, for an example, fiercely loyal to their heritage, the same as Patek, the same as Cartier. It's as long as they don't ignore their own history, their DNA, then I think brands actually can produce product that appeals to everybody. The minute they go, oh, we're missing something, it becomes a fruit machine. Like so, putting in 3 different things. What's the next option? We haven't got ladies. We haven't got pink. We haven't got a small case size. You pull the lever. Bang, 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 bang. That's the new collection because that's what a computer says. So looking for areas and trends that to fill a gap is different to appealing to a collector, I think. And I think that's my concern is where the difference has been. They've gone, watchmakers, brands have gone, we don't have the right collection for ladies. But people don't know who are buying watches for ladies and what ladies, that statistic of over 50% of purchases are men, but they're buying a lot of watches for women. Are they buying watches that they think women want? That's a whole different panel discussion. We haven't got time to
women want?
Yeah, what do so the space is changing, but as long as the brands are loyal to their own heritage and their own story, as you were talking about storied, but I think the 2 examples you've used are very feminine brands in their own right. So that might be a reason why they had the pull coming the other way around.
Do you think that having more women in design roles at brands would help that because it's coming from a authentic women-led point of view, like the same that fashion has made that more accessible in those brands? If you had more women in a design role, that would naturally feed through and they'd be able to put their own spin on a heritage. Do you see what I mean?
I would say it's about more having, women throughout the entire ecosystem, but more in perhaps research and development and even those like top board meetings. I think typically a lot of the time when we're being shown a watch or presented a watch, a lot of people base women's assumptions towards that watch based on the design. And sometimes it feels like design is classed as a bit of a pejorative way to appreciate a watch. And that's 100% my standpoint. I look at a watch in terms of its design, its physicality, its aesthetics. And that is also because the technical side is something I'm on a journey with, and I want to be in a place where I really can dig deeper with that. But I think, yes, it's fundamental to have people on those design teams where they can speak to what women want. But I think it would also be interesting to see those people exist in every tier, and more in the research and development, and on the watchmaking bench as well.
I guess this one's more for you, Sarah. Is there anything that you think brands are underestimating from what you see that customers want?
If I can just go back to part of that discussion, I think in the auction world, we're in a really nice, kind of comfortable, almost neutral position, because we don't sort of have to debate. We can be quite reactive, and I think that's a luxurious position to be in. So we're there feeding back in real time what women want. So obviously, whereas watch development process that can start 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead, we're getting sort of instant feedback on what people are wanting today. So we were talking about Piaget stone dials and things like that, and so we sold one the other day for like 17,000, and the precedent wasn't there for that, but we can say, this is the level we're at now potentially, and obviously we've known that's what people are interested in, but it just shows you that even as recently as last week, that's what people were interested in. So as I say, it's luxurious. We're getting this sort of real-time feedback, and then we can then look at whether we need to change prices or whether we need to feature more wrist shots of that particular type of watch in order to bring more people in, whether we should put it on a man's wrist or women's wrist. So I realise that we don't sort of have to put our money where our mouths are, but we can give that feedback, and so it's a really nice kind of position to be in.
Do you think brands should utilise auction houses and that sort of side of things as a resource for their?
I think that they do, and I think that in the past, so when I started the industry sort of 15 years ago, I feel like for a lot of brands, many of them obviously do and did have heritage kind of divisions, but there was perhaps a disconnect between their new and their pre-owned. So they would almost want to distance themselves, other than buying for their own museums or their collections, they might want to distance themselves from the pre-owned market, because it wasn't necessarily connected to them potentially sort of financially or otherwise. But now obviously, especially with CPO, there's a real nice connection between pre-owned and new. So I like to think that they are, obviously paying attention, but it is also easier for them to, if they are connected to that kind of pre-owned side of it.
And Faye, from working in the retail side of things, was that anything you experienced working with auction houses to look at how the pre-owned market was doing? Looking at your buy?
Not so much pre-owned, but we had a huge amount of data, and most retailers now are very commercially driven. So we would go, you were talking about when you go into the appointments and everyone was asking particular watches, we would go in with tens of pages of data and whether a diamond dial works better on that case size versus it was analysis paralysis. When I started watch buying, it was actually a really sexy thing to do, and I was able to operate viscerally, and now it's like, no, computer says no. If you're trusted well enough by the company you work for, you'd be able to buy into certain things that, for example, Oris's Kermit, that should never ever work in any guise, but the minute I saw it land, it was like, this is going to be brilliant, and it did work, and it sold out, and it's been a great model. So if you're just operating in terms of logistics and statistics, then we might well be replaced by AI, but again, that's another conversation. We used our own data. We didn't use external, although what we did was, or the retailers they'll have an understanding of who's performing, what's not performing. Brands perform differently in different regions as well. So you've got to be quite reactive and responsive. Auction house information wasn't something we went to, it was our own data, but with 200 stores across the UK and 52 in the States, we had sufficient information at our fingertips.
And I think this one probably goes out to Scarlett most. So social media, in terms of in terms of growing journalistic coverage, is really served to amplify female voices, whereas maybe before they weren't as heard, and opinions come so much more easy to brands now because you look in the comments section, you get them straight away. How much impact is that having on trends and brand visibility in serving women as customers?
Yeah, I think it's prolific. I think, we all consume Instagram probably way too much every single day, and that's a main outlet for receiving information. I don't really use my Instagram anymore for like personal kind of joy. It's more, my entire feed is filled with watches, and I love that, and I've curated it to be like that for a certain reason. So I think from a brand perspective, it is your direct line to consumer in that way. And I think the one thing that's the most advantageous about platforms such as Instagram and TikTok is being able to communicate through other people's perspectives, which I think we constantly need more and more of in this industry. I think it's a huge tool for brands to be able to almost filter their voice through certain individuals that they select, or whether that's down to collectors that completely love a brand or a specific watch and want to communicate about that. And to come back to my friends that don't know about stone dial trends, they send me profiles sometimes and they're like, I saw this woman like showing this watch and it's really cool. Like, is this watch any good? So seeing it sort of filter down to their feeds where they're not engaging at all is really great to see. I think TikTok, we're only really at the beginning of experiencing what watch talk is looking like. I think there's still so much more growth for that. But I think it's only a great thing. I do want to just add as well, going back to my earlier comment, in terms of the two brands that I also named, a third one I will throw into the ring was Omega last year when they introduced their 30mm Aquaterra and did a huge global campaign about that. I do think that was a real stellar moment for women's watches. And again, a brand that doesn't have the sort of heritage of, jewelry or being predominantly female. So I think that was a successful moment as well that we should highlight there.
And to that point, what you mentioned about brand ambassadors and stuff, how much importance do you place on having the right person in speaking to the right audience of women, in terms of, because like you said, Timothy is probably done more as a man, which is, the irony isn't lost on me that man's done more for women's watches. But what importance do you place on having the right person as a brand? And maybe that one goes to you, Ellie, as well, having the right brand ambassador to speak to.
Yeah, I think just to sort of caveat here as well, if you think of what many watch brands have been existing for hundreds of years, and the amount of segmentation and work that's done on men, and yet then we talk about female and we automatically clump female into one group as like the female. I also think like it's so important that the female sector is growing exponentially within the industry, and I can see that growing over time, hence why more brands are kind of targeting a watch that could appeal to females. I think, so when then we come to like brand ambassadors, I think it then coming back to sort of customer centricity and also brands being crystal clear on which segments of females they want to grow with. Then of course I think, a celebrity or a brand ambassador or, an influencer, KOL, however you want to term it, if it's the right person that's connecting with the brand, who the brand want to connect with, I think they can do a brilliant job. But equally, men can also do a fantastic job for females. It's just being clear on the brand, like who you're trying to speak to, and therefore whom is the best personality to reach those consumers that you're trying to speak with. It's a bit of a science. It's not, I think it's a lot of people kind of think that it's straightforward, but actually there should be a lot of kind of data and science behind like the strategy and how you're trying to reach whichever part of the female segment that you're trying to engage with.
Scarlett, did you have any thoughts about it?
Yeah. No, I think I completely agree. And I think for me, the most fundamental part of keeping this industry going and having a very healthy, prosperous future for many centuries to come is to cross-pollinate with as many other different industries as possible, not just for the sake of it, but to have intention. And, Faye, you used that word authenticity earlier. I think this is where it really comes into play. When I think about when I first joined the industry, my sort of baptism of fire was within the first week of getting a job I was an editor, and I don't know how I was an editor at 23 with literally not knowing what a tourbillon was. But I was flown out to, with my boss, to go and see the Grubel Forzi manufacturer. And I'd never, ever even seen like the inners of a watch before. And I remember going, and just the feeling I had was frustration when I left that manufacturer, that this universe was never communicated to me in any way. Like, I could, tell you what a fashion atelier would look like and perhaps talk through a garment. But with a watch, I was just absolutely clueless. And I remember calling my mum being like, why did we never discuss this? Like, Dad, like, why have I never asked you about your watch, kind of thing. And I just remember feeling that sense of frustration. And now my sort of standpoint, and from them, was everything I'd sort of learned in fashion. I tried to understand where it intersected with this industry and where it completely differed. And we talk a lot about this industry being quite slow in certain places where we perhaps look to other creative disciplines such as fashion and, acknowledge and accept that they move a lot quicker. So coming back to your point there, I think it is important, and it's vital for us to intersect with brand ambassadors that are representing different types of craftsmanship or disciplines or talent, etc., because it completely opens up the doors of watches to new people. So hopefully in a way that, I was 24 and didn't have a clue about watches, someone that, is growing up will know about them far earlier than I did.
So I guess my last question is kind of a biggie. For you, what will signal that the industry is actually truly recognise women authentically as market shapers rather than an audience to market at? What is it to you that will signal that sort of that changes happened?
Events like this are brilliant, and to to reference the last panel, and actually what you've just said about education, bringing those events to a female audience. I think this is great because it's the first time it's been done, so congratulations, WatchPro. However, we shouldn't have to do it. It should be a inclusive event, and that will be the signifier for me when you've got these great events for people who love watches, who love the brands, who engage with them. And I don't think this should stop, and I think there should be more. I think there should be dinners. I think there should be collectors clubs. I'd, love to see sort of IWC do a event where women could sit in front of so we can learn the like you said, the mechanics and how things work, because that's that engagement and that's that storytelling. But that should be out of choice, not as a necessity. And at the moment, this feels like it's a necessity. And so well done. But the minute we have an equal voice in all of these events, then it works.
Sarah, what about for you?
I guess for us as an auction house, again, we've got the advantageous kind of position that we do have lots of different departments. So we are not working in isolation just with watches and people that like watches. So we've got other categories. So I think for us, it's when we have events or just auctions and previews, that when we see all different types of people coming in, all different genders. So we would tend to look at it more widely rather than just how can we bring more women in. We want to bring in everyone from all walks of life, and we want them to feel included and not kind of alienated in any way. And we want to show them every watch that we can. So we might have an event with our cars department, which is really successful and very international, or jewellery and also whiskey and that sort of thing. So I think the moment that we can comfortably say that the attendance is very, very mixed across all groups, then I think we'll feel that we're on the right direction. And we already are, to be fair. And even in the few years that I've been in Bonhams, I've seen a massive shift, and with people everybody feeling that little bit more comfortable.
Ellie?
I think we definitely started. I think, we've mentioned 2 or 3 brands already that are kind of excelling in the space within the female sector. So I think, the journey has begun, and many more brands are starting to kind of invest more. I guess fundamentally it's about women taking up 50% of the market share, which let's see how long that takes. But I think at that point then we can arguably say that, that the segment and the sector is kind of on a par to that of men.
Scarlett?
I think having women employed in every tier of the ecosystem, I mean, perhaps it feels like a bit of a pipe dream right now, and it shouldn't, but I think that enables people to be mentored by women, and I've never had that in my career. Every boss I've pretty much ever had has been a man, and I'm not hating on men here at all. But it would be nice to experience the watch industry through the perspective of a female leader. And I think second to that, I wish there were more like sixth form and university programs. Oh, am I being shut off? Sorry.
That's enough from you.
Too much. I wish in sixth form, I remember we used to have so many talks about doctors come in, and thank God for doctors, they save lives, but I don't want to be a doctor, I'd be terrible. And I wish we'd had people come in and tell us about this industry and say that there's space for everyone, even if, maths and engineering side, I'm terrible at that, but there are so many jobs in the watch industry and beyond that you can do if that doesn't speak to you. So I would say education.
Hear you. Okay, I'm going to open up some questions. Does anyone have any? Yes, go for it.
So is there a way the industry could just get in and disrupt how they have spoken to women when it comes to watches? Like just come in there and then just talk to us about the technical specs, because we can multitask. That means we have the capability of understanding, of knowing more about the innards of a watch. So tell us about the components, because most women know about everything that's happening around everything, homes and work. So tell us the same thing about watches. Is there a possibility like brands like Bremont can just like go on social media right now and just literally have a conversation with women unprompted, telling us about the components of a watch? Unprompted. We will listen. I promise.
But I think when we're kind of launching high complication pieces, it's not with a view of this is only for men to digest and understand and read. The communication is there, it's product specific, shall we say. So it's not that we are not trying to communicate to women, it's the information is there, and then it's maybe the question is, do women feel that it's the right information for them to digest? But certainly from our perspective, the communication isn't targeted specifically for men. Does that answer your question? I'm kind of being a little bit throwing it back at you there.
I do appreciate that from a like product release, it's specific, but it feels that on average, like technical conversations are directed towards men. And like there was a statement, I think Faye said that there's no need to gender every single piece of watch, because a complication is a complication. It's not gendered. Yeah. It's engineering, it's design, it's utility, it's function. So a watch, it is exactly that. It's engineering, it's utility, it's function, and then there's design, which comes in later on. But the utility and the engineering, can you speak to women towards utility and engineering? Do you want a watch that keeps time, that you don't have to wind, that you don't have to remove the battery because it is sustainable? I know I'm saying this today, I'm wearing a battery watch, but can you have a conversation with me and say, oh yeah, you can have an automatic watch, 72-hour power reserve. If you wear it more often, if you put it in a winder, you're never going to have to worry about it not keeping time. So all those conversations, from my experience as a consumer of watch brands, I've never bumped into that piece of information. I had to go look for it. So can you speak to us like that, like adults who can, understand some stuff, and then we buy from that perspective. That is for me like it's a disruption, because maybe the trends are not necessarily there yet, but disrupt the industry, disrupt the space, see what happens, take the risk. You can afford it, guys.
Cool. Does anyone else have any questions? Whilst I'm roaming. All good? Amazing. Oh, go on.
I'm quite curious on the consumer journey from a female perspective, and that was a question from a collector's view, but also open for the others. If that is like, how is that being shaped, being like woman new to watches from like the general public, and if you see any differences from a typical man's consumer journey, basically like how women approach watches, and what you are seeing, if you are seeing anything like different from the typical consumer journey.
I think there's less of an obvious route in for women. I think so. Sometimes, so we look at kind of luxury as a group in Bonhams. So you've got jewellery and watches and kind of together a lot of the time, and some other things. And sometimes that will be how women will come at it, would be because they have jewellery, then there seems a natural progression. But it isn't often natural for a woman to think they should have more than one watch. And I may be coming at it from a roundabout way. It would seem that for the most part that men in kind of British culture, watches are there and they punctuate kind of special events and things like that, or men are just better at buying things for themselves, whereas women, I don't mean that in a bad way, I think that's a great thing. I think we all should be good at buying ourselves things. It's just that perhaps for women, I mean, I'm not in retail, and so the conversations that I have are obviously from an auction perspective, but I think there isn't such an obvious entry point for women into watch collecting. There's not so much of a precedent. So, and we do see people coming in, they're buying watches for themselves now more and more, which is really nice. And I hear from friends that are in retail that women are going and buying themselves more jewellery and things and more watches, and it's led that way. But it's just not so obvious for them to have more than one watch. and to buy them for themselves, perhaps. So I think it's just quite a different kind of way. And obviously there'll be people that it's different from one person to the next. Something in a kind of more general point I keep thinking is that my perspective is probably quite strange. So I think I'm commenting objectively on a market, but I'm looking at it very much from the auction world, from growing up in that world, and looking at them from sort of historical point of view, provenance, biographies of watches that we all obsess over, sort of Rolex, Comex and things like that because of the story behind them. But then I'm also in the watch community as a fan and a kind of collector with interest, and neither of those perspectives is the perspective of a normal woman, like female consumer. So I know a lot more, and I also know it from much more kind of narrow places. So my entry into it would almost be irrelevant in a bigger conversation. So I hope that makes some sense, but it's just, I think they're very different.
Thank you very much for your insights so far. I've just got a question with regards to probably a lot of us here with PR or marketing backgrounds, and we've obviously moved well beyond the traditional kind of approach of print, etc. And Faye, and I know obviously as well, Scarlett, you've got experience with podcasts. So through the new kind of mediums of communication, how would you approach it with regards to when you're trying to talk to women? Do you feel that perhaps a podcast is the right environment, or socially, how would you approach it with regards to your respective roles?
I think the podcast gives a good opportunity to tap into those that want the information. So where you were talking about disruption earlier, if I was to do a piece, I've done a couple of episodes where it's women in watches. Largely it was a lifestyle crossover as well. So I did women, wine and watches, which was a lot of fun. On the back of a boat, we drank lots of wonderful sparkling wines and champagnes, but I paired it with nautically themed watches. So that gave me the opportunity to work in the space with really incredible women in a very different industry for us to cross over. So I think that my particular avenue has worked for me because that's what I wanted to do. I stepped away slightly from a corporate role where I'd learned so much, but I was curious about investigating in a slightly different way. So from my perspective, I think so. But I think though that level of content, whether it's podcasts or as we're seeing a lot more women on social media, that gives that wider reach for whether it's disruption or education.
Yeah, I think the digital strategies have to almost be multiple. You have to kind of be, if we want to hit a spectrum of women, you've got to hit it in, Instagram and the podcast and TikTok, whatever. I spoke earlier with you, Ella, to answer your question about social media and how I say it's great that we're seeing so many people and so many women championed on the space and them championing watches. But my fear with that is because the attention span is so small on social media that we only kind of get into the top tier stuff. We never really get too much into the nitty gritty. And, that's the part that people can really fall in love with about this industry. So, to Faye, for instance, something like a podcast, that really is the medium which to dig deeper and find that information that you want to know more about. So I think you can't really just have the view of focusing on one. I think sort of strategy overall is female domination at every level, I guess.
Yeah, I think it then comes back, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but it really comes down to whom you're trying to speak with and understanding a bit more about that consumer set within the female audience. So where are they finding information? Where are they going to hear about the brand? How can you connect with them? And I think then once you have a clearer understanding of whom you're trying to speak with, then building a strategy to ultimately engage with them. But holistically speaking, I think women are probably more linked with communities. I think we often speak with friends, family, colleagues to kind of source thoughts and input, probably a bit more than men who historically or kind of would go and do the research a bit more, whereas word of mouth and kind of recommendation is a lot stronger for females. So some sort of community-led communication as well could be quite an interesting approach.
Thank you, ladies.
Well, yeah, that brings us to the end of today's event. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate the remarkable women in our industry. Your presence and participation here today makes these initiatives so meaningful. I'd also like to say a special thank you to the WatchPro team and events team for bringing this vision to life. So thank you, everybody. And as well as celebrating you all today, the heart of this initiative is our Women in Watches list, which shines a spotlight on 12 leaders across education, retail, brands, marketing, media, and watchmaking. Women whose influence is redefining the industry at every level. So do keep an eye out for that list in our March issue of WatchPro. Thank you.